there has been a lot of focus lately, and for good reason, on the huge crowds, all the packed arenas across the country that are out there, all the people supporting the Harris-Walz ticket. We're showing you some of the footage there. And these crowds tell us, of course, that people are excited. They're energized. And Trump's reaction to these crowds has also told us a lot about him. I mean, after Harris and Walz filled yet another arena in Michigan with a sea of very real, alive supporters, the former president of the United States and Republican nominee posted a statement on social media, and I'm going to read it to you in full, because seeing it is one thing, but hearing it is another. I'm also going to tell you why. So here it is, quote, "Has anyone noticed that Kamala cheated at the airport? There was nobody at the plane, and she AI'd it and showed a massive crowd of so-called followers. But they don't exist. They didn't exist. She was turned in by a maintenance worker at the airport when he noticed the fake crowd picture, but there was nobody there. Later confirmed by the reflection of the mirror-like finish on the vice presidential plane. She's a cheater. She had nobody waiting, and the crowd looked like 10,000 people. Same thing is happening with her fake crowds at her speeches. This is the way the Democrats win elections, by cheating, and they're even worse at the ballot box. She should be disqualified because the creation of a fake image is election interference. Anyone who does that will cheat at anything." Those are Trump's words. He posted them. Now, if a friend of yours or someone in your family posted that on social media, you'd be very concerned. I mean, you might even try to get them some professional help, like right away. But this is not your older uncle or your neighbor who's losing it. This guy wants to be the commander-in-chief again. Here's what Harris campaign senior advisor David Plouffe tweeted. Quote, "These are not conspiratorial rantings from the deepest recesses of the internet. The author could have the nuclear codes and be responsible for decisions that will affect us all for decades." And he's right. I mean, one of the biggest stories of this presidential election right now should be that one of the candidates is spewing unhinged conspiracy theories, usually reserved for the darkest corners of the internet. Now, on a personal level, this type of unhinged conspiracy spewing is something a person does when they are on some level quite disconnected from reality. They are maybe frankly unwell. But I'm not here to diagnose Donald Trump. I'm here to look at what is happening underneath all that crazy. Because when you cut through the craziness, the random capitalization that you might need help, like right now, vibe of that post, there is something perhaps more sinister happening here. I mean, if we're being generous and acknowledging there could be some level of strategy here, this is all part of Trump's sinister plan to undermine Kamala Harris, to prime his supporters to question the outcome of the 2024 election, to condition his base to not even believe what they're seeing with their own eyes. He uses words like cheater, cheating, fake crowds. This is all in this post. Should be disqualified. These are messages to his followers. Of course, this is far, far from the first time Trump has done this, even just over the past few weeks. I mean, take NPR's fact check of Trump's rambling press conference that was very hard to watch at Mar-a-Lago last week. They found that he lied a whopping 162 times in 64 minutes, which, by the way, is not exactly easy to do. And one of those lies that he repeated several times was suggesting that Harris's nomination is unconstitutional. Of course, as NPR put it, there's nothing in the U.S. Constitution about picking presidential candidates. And earlier this month, who can forget when Trump said that Harris happened to turn black? So basically, the crowds aren't real, her support isn't real, her spot on the ballot isn't real, her race isn't real. Don't believe what you are seeing. Believe me. That is what Trump is doing. And here is why. I mean, right now, he's looking at a race where his opponent is leading in 3 of the core swing states, raising a whole lot more money than him, holding a whole lot more events than him, and is about to go into an enthusiastic Democratic convention. Harris is doing really well right now. Doesn't mean it won't be a tough campaign. She's doing well right now. So Trump is looking for ways to delegitimize her support and even her standing on the ballot in an effort to call into question what could be a victory for her in November. In other words, reality isn't looking so great for Trump, so he is sowing doubt in reality. It's an old trick of his, favorite trick of his. Just ask Joe Biden. And it's happening again. So yeah, Trump is coming across as unhinged and unwell, and he may be both. But to the extent that there is a strategy underneath his incredibly concerning behavior, this, in my view, is it. Now, George Conway is a conservative attorney. Sarah Matthews is a former Trump White House deputy press secretary. I know they both have a lot of thoughts, and they both join me now. So, George, I'm going to start with you because you have not held back on Twitter. You never do. You never hold back in person either, reacting to this post from Trump. So don't hold back now. What does this post say about Trump and where he thinks he stands in the election?
He is a decompensating, narcissistic sociopath. He is a very unwell person. I've been saying this for years. If you go through you don't want to diagnose him, but I think if you look at the diagnostic criteria for narcissistic personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder in the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, he fits every single one of them. It's like the criteria were made to describe him, and we can observe that just from 1 week, but we've been observing it now for 7 years. And what happens to these characters, and these are the type of people who become cult leaders, authoritarian dictators. These kinds of people ultimately go too far and they destroy themselves. And when they reach that point of no return where they're basically spiraling, they become delusional and they can become psychotic. And I think what we saw with this tweet yesterday is that last final collapse of Donald Trump's mental state. I mean, you think about it, saying that those were like 50, 60, 70,000 people in the aggregate in five rallies in different states. Jonathan Chait put this, of New York Magazine, put it this way today. It's like, that's loopier than saying that the moon landings were staged, because there were tens of thousands of people were there. And there are hundreds of people taking photographs and videos. To think that is crazy and to try to sell it to people is just as crazy. He's done. His brain is fried.
So, Sarah, I mean, you can also add to anything George said. By all means, he kind of covered it there. But, I mean, I read that because I think it's important for people to hear, right? I mean, those are Trump's words. He posted them. No one's making anything up here. It's a lot for people to manage on the campaign. You've worked for him. What's going on there behind the scenes?
I think that he feels this election slipping away from him. And that's where you're beginning to see him spiral and cling to these conspiracy theories, as you noted, with the AI-generated crowds, which obviously can be easily disproven. And despite him claiming that there's this photo with, no reflection of the crowd.
Don't feel like you have to explain it.
I know. It's insanity, though. It truly is. And there will be people out there that will believe it, though, because he's pushing it. And that's what happens when he gets desperate, is he pushes these conspiracy theories. And not just this one. It's him kind of leaning into Kamala Harris's racial identity, or him even going after and attacking the popular governor of Georgia, Brian Kemp, and his wife. These are not winning campaign messages, but that is what he does when he feels like he's under attack, is he uses these kinds of lines of defense that don't make much sense for campaigning. I can assure you that his campaign team is telling him to talk about policy. They want him to go out there and talk about the economy and immigration and things that voters actually care about. Because I can assure you that none of these things that he's talking about in his rallies or his Truth Social posts are things that are top of mind for most voters.
No question about it. I mean, I know they say they want to talk about policy. That's what everybody says, right? And he's doesn't seem capable of that. So he seems very unhinged and all the things you said earlier, George. But there is sort of an underlying theme here, right? Which is him kind of questioning what the outcome might be. This is not valid. She's not valid. She's unconstitutional as a candidate, which is not a thing, I think you can confirm. Right. Talk to me a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of the, other aspects of his efforts that we should be concerned about. Instead of, we're just calling him unhinged, it wasn't unhinged, but what else are you seeing in terms of his behavior and what they're preparing in that regard? I
think you're right that he's basically preparing to say that the election was stolen again from him. And that's an old trick. I mean, even in 2016, he was saying that if he loses, it was going to have the election, that the election would have been stolen from him. That's something that narcissists do. They basically blame others. They can't accept their own faults. They can't accept defeat. So they basically came, you cheated. He cheated. She cheated. Everybody cheated. Didn't happen. And he's reaching to the point where, and it's for him, he's not very smart. But he has a reptilian intelligence, and that reptilian intelligence tells him to do that, to deny reality and to get other people to deny reality. But this time, he's really gone over the edge.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
because he's looking at I mean, he's not just running for president. He's running from prison. He's already a convicted felon. If that case in Florida ever goes to trial, he's going to get convicted, and he's going to get convicted down the street because the Supreme Court's immunity decision only goes so far to protect him. He's looking at prison. He could go to prison for the rest of his life, and he is terrified of that.
Which means, and I agree, it means that he is maybe more desperate, perhaps, than he was even in 2020. Then it was about
Which is scary.
Winning an election. Now it's a little different. And you know, I think everybody remembers this, but just to reiterate, you quit the administration after January 6th because of what you saw. That was, of course, the culmination of all of this in 2020. What is it like to sit and watch? I mean, there's pebbles of details here we're seeing, the way he posts things, his preparation to question the outcome, to lead up to something similar.
Yeah, we saw this happen in 2020 where he started questioning the legitimacy of mail-in ballots. So he was laying the groundwork ahead of the election to then say that it was fraudulent. And obviously we know that there is zero evidence of that. And then after the election, he kept clinging to even more crazy conspiracy theories because his advisors were telling him what he didn't want to hear, which was that he lost and there was zero evidence of fraud. So then he started listening to people who were telling him what he wanted to hear. And as George noted, I am concerned about how he is going to be more desperate heading into 2024 to ensure that he wins, because I've long said he is not running to make America great again. He is running to stay out of prison. And so if he doesn't win this election, then he's scared of what will happen as a result. And I think we're not talking about enough the things that his campaign is saying, too. Even one of his top campaign advisors, Chris LaCivita, recently said that the election will not be decided on Election Day. It will be on Inauguration Day, and when Donald Trump swears his oath with his hand on the Bible. And a recent Rolling Stone investigation showed that there are 70 pro-Trump election deniers who will be playing a role as election officials in key battleground states across the country. That is terrifying, because even if there is evidence or no evidence of fraud or anything to suggest that Trump won and Kamala wins,
in 2020, right?
Then these people will be pushing the things that he wants, and that is their backup plan. So right now, their plan is to gin up the base, get them excited, and increase turnout, because it doesn't seem at all like they're trying to appeal to swing voters, because when you're talking about crowd sizes and racial identity and attacking Kamala Harris for that's not a winning message. So their backup plan, though, is to default on claiming that this election was stolen or rigged, as they did in 2020, but it's going to be even more extreme in 2024.
Those are such good reminders, everything you listed. I want to play, so George, I want to play a portion of an ad that your PAC, Anti-Psychopath PAC, your name, not mine, is putting out on cable starting tomorrow, because it's really interesting. People should see it.
Not enough people want to go to his rallies anymore. They want to go to Kamala Harris's rallies. Enjoy the rallies while they last, Donald, because where you're going, you're not going to be able to have any.
First of all, that's your voice.
Yes, it is. I missed my calling. I spent 30 years practicing law. I could have been doing TV voiceovers.
You could have a future. Yeah. I mean, look, I think watching that, the crickets even, are you trying to drive him crazy? Is that the goal of those ads?
No, I mean, our whole point, my Anti-Psychopath PAC has basically 4 objects. One is to point out his mental disorders. Second is to explain why his mental disorders are dangerous for the country. Third is to get the media to talk about it, because I think the failure to talk about the fact that he is mentally disordered, and every psychiatrist you ever talk to or psychologist will tell you that behind closed doors, has normalized him. We are just, he said a lot of insane things before yesterday. And all of a sudden we have to wait for the most insane thing at all to say, oh, wow, he's crazy. It's like we've gotten so used to the craziness that it takes something like saying 50,000 people or 70,000 people weren't there for people to start maybe talking about.
Well, we're talking about it. We can't get numb to it, George.
Right. And the fourth thing I want to do is to provoke him into demonstrating those qualities of insanity that he tends to qualify.
Well,
And he has already responded to one of our ads
If he sees that ad,
by
it might
attacking
provoke
Fox News
him.
and Fox, and
Stay tuned. If he responds to this ad over the next hour, we will tell everybody. George Conway and Sarah Matthews, always really enjoy talking to you both. Thank you so much.